Hello, my name is Adam Chilton. I'm the Dean of the University of Chicago Law School. I'm joined today by Dr. Richard Sandor to discuss his new book, Carbon Hunters. Richard is often dubbed as the father of financial futures for his pioneering work in developing the first interest rate futures contracts during his time as the chief economist and vice president for the Chicago Board of Trade. In fact, Richard coined the term derivatives to describe futures and option contracts traded on the Chicago exchanges during his time in these roles. In addition to his pioneering work in financial markets, Richard also established the Chicago Climate Exchange, a voluntary cap-and-trade system for emissions reductions. It was the world's first, and still only, exchange to facilitate the reduction and trading of all 6 greenhouse gases, and it influenced the creation of voluntary carbon markets. For this work, Richard is often credited as the founder of the field of environmental finance. In fact, Time magazine named Richard as one of the world's heroes of the planet for his work as the founder of the Chicago Climate Exchange. I'm here today to talk to Richard about his newest book, Carbon Hunters: Reflections and Forecasts of Climate Markets in the 21st Century, co-authored with Paula DiPerna, released in September 2025. Richard, thanks for being here to talk to me about your book today. And I want to start by talking about the title itself, Carbon Hunters. Now, the term carbon hunters is wonderfully evocative and evokes a sense of exploration and looking for a new frontier. But what does the term mean, and how did you come up with it?
Carbon Hunters is really derived from a book. When I was a kid, I read a book called Microbe Hunters, which was popular science, and it was a series of stories about inventions in science and medicine. Leeuwenhoek, who did the first microscope, Louis Pasteur, and then Ehrlich, who was famous for inventing the field of immunology. And I felt that the journey of financial innovation was very much like medical innovation and industrial innovation. It was just a different track. I was particularly attracted by Ehrlich, who won a Nobel Prize in 1907 or something like that. There was a movie made by Edward G. Robinson called Magic Bullets. And he was a father of immunology as we know it, but what struck me about it, his major breakthrough drug was Salvarsan 606, which was a pre-runner to a cure for syphilis, actually. And what I found interesting was the title of the drug, 606, which meant he got it wrong 605 times. And so I think that's the story of inventive activity. A lot of clinical trials, a lot of mistakes. And so I thought I'd adapt it and choose Carbon Hunters.
All right, so the story Carbon Hunters is about your efforts and the efforts along with a number of your colleagues and collaborators to hunt around the world from carbon and find ways that we can reduce emissions to try to protect the climate. But my understanding is that the story really starts with the acid rain program and the success of that program that then segues in to your role in developing climate markets. So can you tell us about what the acid rain problem was and how it was solved?
Sure. In the 1980s, because of the burning of coal, and when coal is burned, it releases sulfur. Sulfur goes into the atmosphere, combines with oxygen, and then rain comes by and you get acid rain. And it was a major problem in the northeastern part of the United States. And there was an effort by legislators, academics, constituents to do something about it. And for the first time, they were going to use a market-based solution, typical University of Chicago. And
Love to hear it.
so I was approached by a group of lime producers who would be part of the solution, because you pass the flue gas through a sludge and the sulfur is leached out. So they were advocating for this program, and they said, would you become an advocate for the program? We'll retain you. Write a paper about how big this market might be, and to the extent that you can, advocate to members of the legislature. And they said, do you think you can use your experience as an inventor of interest rate futures and financials? Is there a way you can commoditize air the way you did rates? And I said, sure. And so I ended up writing the paper. The act passed, was part of the Acid Rain Advisory Committee, got the Chicago Board of Trade to hold auctions, and we actually did the first trade in SO2 allowances, and we financed the utility, bought 30 years of forward allowances, present valued them. It was a poor municipal utility in Henderson, Kentucky, and they would have had to borrow the money. And we said, hold on, you're going to get below the cap. So why don't we buy all of the excess reductions that you have, and we'll find a utility that can't build a scrubber because they don't have acreage. And rather than that utility shutting down, they will be in compliance for 30 years. And that's roughly what happened. So the first registered trade in the EPA registry was done by my company, Environmental Financial Products. It was called Center, but it still exists today.
All right. So for people that aren't familiar with the acid rain problem, since in some sense it's been addressed, how effective was it? Does this continue to work? Did we address acid rain as a result of some of this cap and change?
Yeah, the acid rain program was a home run for all of us involved in law and economics and power generation. We had 18 million tons of acid rain, 18 million tons of sulfur emitted in the 80s. It's down to 2 or 3 million tons. The total program cost about $3 billion, and the benefit annually, and the benefits annually are about 150 billion.
Hold on, wait a second. So it was 3 billion total for the program.
Yeah.
And the annual benefits are 150 billion?
3 billion annually in costs, 150 billion annually. That's basically a reduction in medical costs associated with lung disease, and about 30 to 40,000 people are alive today that died every year from lung problems. Not only that, those benefits don't even include the beauty that came from not having forests that were defoliated or rivers that were acidic.
Incredible.
And it is, I think, the emblem of what you can do with a market-based solution to environmental objectives, where you can create profits from not polluting as opposed to making money from polluting. It switched the dynamics around 180 degrees.
All right. Simply incredible that you were able to have that kind of success developing markets to use that as a market-based tool to try to stop acid rain. But this book is primarily the story not about your success in the acid rain program, but your success and your efforts to turn that kind of approach and that kind of mechanism to go after carbon, greenhouse emissions, and ultimately climate change. Now, the story you tell where this really gets going is in 1992. at the Earth Summit in Rio. So this was a moment of global awakening. What happened? What made you so interested then?
In 1991, the United Nations contacted me and said, "We're doing something in Rio in 1992. We understand that you worked on the acid rain program. Do you think that what you did in solving a pollutant like acid rain, could that be done internationally with carbon?" And so I went to Geneva in December, met with a number of economists and environmental groups. The UN said, "Jesus, that sounds interesting. Would you deliver a paper?" Which I did, called In Search of Trees, saying that I thought that a worldwide carbon market was feasible and could be a way to address concerns with potential climate change.
So uh, at this moment, when you're first setting out to this solution, you came in contact with your co-author on this book. And can you tell us a little bit about how that conversation took place, how you met Paula DiPerna and started working together on this topic and ultimately writing the book?
Yeah, the interesting thing, it was like, think of it as a split screen movie. She was on one side of it, and she had come down and worked with Jacques Cousteau and spent her career taking the Calypso 1,000 miles up the Amazon. And she was a real explorer, and she was there, and Cousteau was meeting with Castro, and very, very famous. And I was in an academic part of the UN giving a paper, and we didn't meet. But 3 years later, that United Nations had a meeting in Glen Cove, Long Island, and I was asked to represent UNCTAD and to give a paper, and I gave a paper. And she was in the audience, and the audience sat there, and I said, the only way to really do this is to try it, okay? Do not look at it as an academic exercise. If you want to build a market, you have to do it. Nobody paid any attention, but having read Microbe Hunters and having done a PhD dissertation on inventive activity, I was undaunted. And I said, nah, nobody's paying any attention to me. Who is this guy talking up there? Except Paula came up after. She said, that was really phenomenal. Nobody seemed to pay attention to you, but what you said really resonated, that the only way we'll know if a market can work in achieving greenhouse gas reductions at low prices is to build one. And I said, great, let's be in touch. And we stayed in touch over the years. And then the crowning moment came when she became president of the Joyce Foundation here in Chicago, $1 billion. And she called me up and I said, hi, Paula, what's up? And she said, well, I'm in town. It was Bastille Day. And would you have lunch? Because remember that remark you made in 1995? I'm now president of a major philanthropic foundation, and I'd love to talk to you about that. And we met at the university club, no papers allowed. So on the back of a napkin, we sketched out what might be a voluntary market in carbon dioxide.
All right, so is this idea that you're sketching on the back of a napkin over lunch on Bastille Day, is this what turned into the Chicago Climate Exchange?
Exactly. She said, I can't do this. She was really inventive. She said, but I'm going to make up an inventive grant, and I'll call it a Millennium Grant. And I'll make it specially for you. How much do you need? So I sketched out a budget, and I couldn't implemented because I was a private sector firm. I had taught at Kellogg for over the years. So Don Jacobs, the dean, said, here, you're a research professor. Why don't you run the grant through Kellogg? And that way you as a private sector could do it. So it was innovative. So it went from the Joyce Foundation to Kellogg, and Kellogg then employed Environmental Financial Products to do the feasibility study.
All right, so you've got the idea, you've now got the grant, you've got the funding. What did you actually build? Tell us what the Chicago Climate Exchange was, and what did it turn into?
I went around and I was like a opening act of a major star. I was the starter, and I went and I sold and I peddled and I groveled to well over 100 separate entities and said, would you participate in the design of a voluntary market to reduce CO2 emissions? And ultimately, I got 27 out of the 100 plus to agree to participate. They signed a soft letter of commitment that they would participate in the design of this exchange.
So these 27 things, these are big companies, they're utility firms. What are the people?
They are all of those. They are forest products companies like International Paper. They're manufacturers like Ford. They're utilities like American Electric Power. And they are chemical companies like DuPont. And I said, okay, we're going to separate you into manufacturing, forest products, power. You're each going to come up with a set of reduction targets and a number of years to reach those reduction targets and a baseline. So we had dozens of meetings here in Chicago. People flew in, and we spent a year and a half designing a prototype, which instead of calling it the Kyoto Protocol, we called it the Chicago Accord. And the Chicago Accord was a guiding light for the development of 100-page rules and regulations about achieving these reductions. So the long and short of it was the big thing was to get people to commit. And the first difficulty was nobody wants to be first, Adam, right? So, and they didn't want the cover. They didn't want to be standing alone. And so one of the people, Marty Zimmerman, who was the chief economist at Ford, said, look, we'll come in, but you got to get somebody else to come in. And then I went to DuPont and I said, AP will come in. Will you jump in the pool holding their hands? And then I went to International Paper and I said, would you do that? And in between, Richie Daley was a friend and he agreed to be chairman. And I said, we'll get the city of Chicago involved, but you're going to have, and we had an advisory committee that consisted of deans at universities, people like Tom Lovejoy, who worked for the Carnegie Foundation and alerted people to the problems of the Amazon disappearing. So we had a golden list on Jacobs and et cetera. And so, and I also kept the University of Chicago well advised because Ronald Coase was a friend and a mentor of mine. And during the Acid Rain program, he had served as the opening speaker. And then he had spoken at another event that I convened, for which Ellen and I hosted a party, and Bill Daley was the keynote speaker. Ronald Coase did it, the head of the Brazilian Space Agency, the head Michael Zamet-Kudahar, the United Nations Framework for Climate Change. We had a number of people. I was on the board of a Swiss first ESG mutual fund. So with the trappings of setting up an exchange were to give credibility to an idea. Finally, with this advisory committee, with 5 notable names, we announced the launch of the Chicago Climate Exchange. And the letter, the soft letter said they would participate in the design, and if and only if it fit their strategies, they would join. So those 5 said it fits our strategy. It was for purposes of the legal community. The only document that was there was a 1-paragraph letter which said, we agree to join the Chicago Climate Exchange and abide by the rules and regulations which are enclosed of the exchange. Now, that was sufficient. The Chicago Accord, a soft letter of commitment, a 1-paragraph commitment, and that was the entire legal structure. The Chicago Accord was only 17 pages. So Adam, as a dean of this great law school, to get that done with that little documentation.
Yeah, it seems seems pretty wild. I gotta say, you can't I don't know sell basically anything with just a paragraph.
A paragraph to reduce emissions when there was no law. Okay,
Yeah.
we have to realize this was a voluntary program, and people agreed to take a legally binding commitment to reduce greenhouse gases in the absence of any mandatory requirement by cities, counties, states, or the federal government.
All right, I gotta say, as dean of the University of Chicago Law School, and I'm also an editor of the Journal of Law and Economics, which is the journal that Ronald Coase, the Nobel laureate, started. Love hearing that his ideas were influential in getting this idea off the ground, that we could have voluntary exchange, markets, and help to try to address climate change. But let me ask this. You've now got the Accord, you've got your 1-paragraph, and you've got some of these rule book and these major companies, Ford, DuPont, et cetera. How did it actually work after that? Did they actually voluntarily reduce carbon? And was there progress once they had agreed to participate in the design?
We did something which you will, I think, further as a dean of a law school find really interesting. Mary Shapiro was a friend of mine, and she ultimately became chairman of the CFTC. And I had worked on the act enabling the Commodity Futures Trading Commission to be born. So she and I became friends. She became chairman of the CFTC. She then became chairman of the SEC. She then became head of the NASD. And I put a call into her and I said, Mary, what I would like you to do is, even though we're not regulated under any act, I want you to regulate my exchange on a private contract. And I think that you should do the kind of auditing that you would do in the case of a utility. Adam, you just go to a continuous emission monitor that the EPA requires, and it has sulfur and NOx, but it also has carbon. That's easy. For Ford, though, you had 30 factories, plus some in Mexico, some in Canada. They wanted to include all of them. You had to really get bills for all of their fossil fuel use and then convert them. I wanted her to be there because of the power of the pulpit, because she, as an NASD, if somebody didn't comply, my CEOs didn't want to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal saying the NASD was investigating them based on the Chicago Climate Exchange for non-compliance. So it was really a powerful tool. So she audited the city of Chicago. We ultimately had 108 members. Every year there was an annual audit. Mary's team would go in and audit them. We had 108 members that were polluters, 400 generally, an emissions group privately. That was the size of Germany. Okay.
Oh, and so the people that you have participating in the Chicago Exchange,
The
their
emission
emissions is like the same emissions as
as Germany.
Germany. All right.
This is a little piddling.
Which is like, yeah, a top 10 economy in the world.
Right.
Yeah.
Top 5.
Yeah,
even,
yeah, right, yeah.
And so between the internal compliance that we had built, there was a compliance committee, and that had to do, and that was headed by Amtrak's representative member. And basically, they went to everybody and would investigate if somebody wasn't in compliance. And they then would report and bring them up in charges if they didn't comply. So it was.
Got it. Okay, so the chart, so you've got the auditing mechanism in place, and it's not legally binding in the sense that, like,
It is legally binding.
Oh, I guess it's legally binding. They've signed up,
but voluntary.
But voluntary. But it's not the case that the Department of Justice was going to show up at the CEO and put him in handcuffs.
No.
But it would show up on the front page of New York Times or something.
NASD would bring charges against them. They
would, your own compliance mechanism.
And they would have to go before a compliance committee of DuPont and AEP, and they would be tried by a jury of their peers. And if in fact they were in violation, we specifically were constructively ambiguous, is the term we use in futures markets. The fines were not specified. So that if there was malice, we could hit them for $10 million. If it was a bookkeeping error, we could fine them $100. So we had a penalty for noncompliance. We had a complete structure, a peer-reviewed compliance committee. Then separately, we had a business conduct committee which monitored their purchases and sales to see if they didn't manipulate the market, if they didn't have any kind of improper behavior in executing the purchases and sales of carbon credits. There was a registry. It was a national effort, and all done privately.
Yeah, so without, a bill passed by the United States Congress or, new regulations that are specifically being promulgated by the EPA or the Department of the Interior, you get firms that collectively represent the emissions the size of Germany together to sign off that they'll participate.
Yeah.
You set up this mechanism of auditing, reporting, a jury of your peers, all voluntary. And through this, you're able to actually get people to reduce their carbon emissions, and in doing so, reduce the implication for greenhouse gases.
Exactly. We did one phase, and then we did a second phase. Because we went, phase one was 4% reduction, and nobody wanted to stop after 2006. And they said, let's keep it going. This is really good.
Yeah.
And then we had a lot of piloting. We engaged, and the National Farmers Union joined. And so we had 15 million acres of 5,000 farmers that would change their soil practices so wouldn't perturb the carbon roots, and for that they could sell their credit. We even had a project in India for rural poor in Kerala. And there are these anaerobic digesters. You put cow manure in it. It's a can, basically. And the methane floats to the top. And you attach a tube to it. And the tube then feeds the gas so that you can, in a hut, use that for cooking as opposed to burning wood. Those particularly anaerobic digesters turned out to be, even for a small household, for $4 a ton of carbon, they could reduce and get 8 or 10 or $20. Well, if you're dealing with a $360 annual income and you make $8 from carbon emissions, it changes. And little girls don't have to go out and fetch wood. So we managed to even go into India and have rural poor use the protocols that we developed to develop changes in behavior among Indians poorest. And they actually use the carbon credits as a currency in the town to buy food. So it was an entire ecosystem. Now, this was in Kerala, which is a communist province, and they're using carbon tons. And we have pictures. They'd come out in reefs, and the CCX, the Chicago Climate Exchange check would arrive, and it was a big festive occasion.
All right. Well, I'm curious what we can learn from all of the successes, the voluntary participation, the market mechanisms, et cetera, that you developed in the Chicago climate change for the current political moment. And here's what I have in mind. At the same time, a few trends are happening. There's, because of the power needed for generative AI, a massive increase all of a sudden in the demands for new electricity. And at the same time that's happening, which of course all of that electricity has implications for the climate, the environment, and climate change. We have political parties in power, not just in the United States and other countries, that seem a little less interested in climate change than they were in the past. So is there anything we can take from your experience developing the Chicago Climate Exchange that can tell us how we can address climate change in this current moment?
I've never been more bullish, in spite of what is apparently an unfriendly environment, in financial innovation and voluntary markets. Okay. If we take a look at the way we designed the climate exchange, a legislation, in our case, the Accord, regulation, NASD, the design of the exchange, the contracting, all of the University of Chicago, it's my firm commitment that this mechanism could be used once again the same way we developed it. And it could be, and we, in the forerunner to this book, made that case in Singapore to a group of ASEAN nations who were where we were 25 years ago and said, you can do something about it. Coupled with Asia, coupled with China, who has just announced a cap on carbon that will come at some time, and he announced it a while back. Couple that with generative AI and 4 or 5%. Couple that with companies like Restoration Climate and Rubicon. I just spoke to a woman this week who has a new startup, and she has analytical tools. Silicon is the name of the company. And what she does is you feed in any data center into our database, put the kind of chips, compute you wanted, and it will generate amount of carbon that you need to have to offset it. So you are now developing out there, Don Wilson, who happens to be a trustee of this great university, now is developing a market where you can buy compute and voluntary or mandatory carbon through the Climate Vault here at the University of Chicago. So right now, my experiences in an inventor is that a lot goes on, and market lows the private sector gets energized and is beginning to and has developed tools that will deal with power becoming a growth industry as opposed to the old utility, anticipating that will be enormous private sector opportunities to commercialize the need. A year ago, Microsoft did a big deal on something like this. I do think that, and these are voluntary, that NVIDIA at some point has to look at this. Intel has to look at it. Amazon has to look at it. These companies that are going to be using the hyperscalers, their customers want them to see, and it's voluntary within a free enterprise system. Never underestimate, the ability of America to reinvent itself. And that's going on, and it's going on through the glaze of environmental objectives.
All right. I want to end by asking you this, which is, as an educator myself, one thing that I love about this book and this story is that you, as an economics professor, are well steeped in the academic ideas, understand the importance of markets, of mechanism design, but you don't just stop at writing the papers for the United Nations. You think, how can I go out there and actually put this idea into practice and try to change the world while doing it? For the young scholars and the young students and people that care about the climate or any other topic, what's the lesson for them about how to approach their careers or tackle these big problems?
I have a very simple way, and I actually, in teaching the course that I now do here at the law school, I say there's an acronym, and I'm going to tell you what my acronym is, and it's CITED, SCITED.
And as a professor, I don't forget the word cited. So yeah, okay, great.
Yeah, so it's cited. That's exactly. Yeah. So what happens? Number one, when there's an environmental problem or anything else, it's prompted by scarcity. Okay, that's the S. Once there's scarcity, you have to make choices. Trade-offs occur. And we know from David Ricardo that people have comparative advantages and they take. Once you do that, you have to build institutions to deal with the scarcity and have it. And that involves University of Chicago incentives.
Great.
Right?
Yeah.
Transactions costs, expectations, and diversification. And if you look at cited with an S,
cited with an S, okay,
you get a very simple flow. Scarcity, it could be water, it could be chips. And anytime you have scarcity and you then have to make choices, you have to design institutions with incentives, transactions costs, expectations, and diversification. If you keep those things in mind, there is enormous commercial logic and opportunity. So I would say to young scholars to look for the development of scarcity, which creates choices, and then try to invest, design, or keep in mind institutional arrangements with those four driving factors.
Wow. It seems like a simple distillation of a career worth of insights there to 5 simple steps. Well, thank you, Richard, for taking the time to talk to me about the new book. It's fantastic, and I wish you the best of success with it.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you for the privilege of teaching it at the law school in this great university. It's an absolute pleasure to be stimulated by colleagues and students at every step of the way. Thank you.
Thank you.